I'm trying to relate the themes of this gathering to my own experience as a Canadian. It's a pretty ordinary story as stories go in many respects. But I think it's very important to situate ourselves in place, in history, and in community. It reminds us of our relationships and of our responsibilities. Today I live with my family on the island of Montreal, and I work at McGill University near the 16th century site of the Iroquoian village of Hochelaga, a couple of kilometers from this hotel. And I'm very grateful for the welcome that Haudenosaunee elders from Kahnawake have given us. We're in this room today thanks to the efforts of many partners. And first and foremost, I want to acknowledge my esteemed colleague, John Scott from the Convention on Biodiversity. And I must mention Thora Herman from the Université de Montréal, who hatched this idea with John. And then they were in touch with me, and we got excited about what we might do here. And together with these, our other partners, including the Quebec Centre for Biodiversity Sciences, which is headquartered at McGill, but which is a Quebec-wide network of scholars working on biodiversity issues. The Canadian Commission for UNESCO, the Indigenous Peoples and Community Conserved Areas Consortium, the ICCA Consortium, Parks Canada, the Assembly of First Nations, and the Center for Biodiversity and Conservation of the American Museum of Natural History. I was born and grew up on the Northern Plains, on Treaty 4 lands in southern Saskatchewan. All Canadians are treaty, all non-Indigenous Canadians are treaty people. Not all Indigenous people in Canada are treaty people. Some continue with unextinguished Aboriginal title. And indeed, those who sign treaties will insist that those are not relationships of extinguishment, but that was a term that was smuggled into the written version of treaties. At any rate, as a child in southern Saskatchewan, I grew up next door to the Carry the Kettle Indian Reserve, in the meaning of the Indian Act, an Indian reserve. It was the home of many of the Nakota First Nation people. People who are more popularly, or were more popularly known as the Assiniboine, which is an interesting name in itself. It derives from the Cree word for the Stony people, the Assini, Stony, Bots, people or strangers, actually, it can mean in various contexts. But the Crees and the Assiniboine were important allies on the Northern Plains. There were members of the Ishapi and Moonface families who traded horses with my paternal grandfather. And when I was a child, these old men would still sometimes come walking across the fields with paying no particular regard to roads and road allowances into which the entire prairies had been surveyed, to stop and talk horses with my father. And I was curious as a young kid to see that no horses ever got exchanged anymore, but they'd still come and talk about trading horses because that was a relationship that they honored and it continued in the memory of my grandfather and their fathers. And there was an old man still living on that reserve as I was growing up. His name was Uchangukaha, the Pathfinder. His English name was Dan Kennedy. He has an amusing story about how he was informed that his name was Dan Kennedy when he was taken to residential school at Lebret near Fort Qu'Appelle in southern Saskatchewan. He died when he was 98, and I was in my early 20s. And he remembered the last of the buffalo before his people were confined to the Carry the Kettle Reserve. He told a story. As a small boy, he and his chums were out and they came across this stretch of prairie where scattered, littered with the bodies of buffalo that had been shot and left in the sun to bloat. And he talked about how they had great fun jumping onto the bellies of these buffalo lying, these bellies that got tight in the sun. They were using them as trampolines. Of course, a tragic story, but old Dan Kennedy had a great sense of humor even in the face of tragedy. So that tragedy, ecological and human, was very experience near. It was still living memory, as in a way that it's certainly not for my children. My family were settlers, but it would be more accurate to say, taking the long view, that our kind are the unsettlers and the unsettled. I take a page here from the work of Hugh Brody in a book called The Other Side of Eden, where he makes the point that the people who are truly rooted in place are the people that we pretend are nomads, but in fact very attached to territory. And it's the farmers who move, continually move and expand and look for the next frontier. About an hour's drive from here, just up the Ottawa River, not far above the confluence with the St. Lawrence, is a village called Lachute. And north of Lachute, another 10 or 15 minutes, my great-great-great-grandparents, who came from County Monaghan in Ireland, and my great-great-grandparents are buried on the lands of Algonquin, Anishinaabe. Sorry, this scrolling here is a little awkward. So, and this is poor land. It's in Laurentians. There's more rocks and marsh than there is arable soil, and it was a hard-scrabble existence. My great-great-grandfather noted in his journal the hunting he did to help to feed the family. Every year, he'd kill 1 or 2 deer and 1 or 2 bear, and even occasionally a caribou. And I was startled to see that. A caribou. You have to go 800 kilometers north of Montreal now to even begin to have a chance of seeing caribou today. These folks were occupying a place called the Glen, and that became the extended family home. To make ends meet, the unmarried sons and sometimes the daughters would head to northern Michigan, other Anishinaabe country, where they would fell and haul trees and cook for the the lumber camps. The Ottawa Valley was already largely depleted of old-growth forest. That's part of the story of there being no more caribou, very few caribou even by that time. So, why are farmers the unsettlers? Because on farms, and especially on the marginal ones, one or two of the children of each generation may stay, but the rest must move on. And so it had always been on both sides of my family, from Scotland to Ireland, from Ireland to Quebec and Ontario, from Quebec and Ontario to Manitoba and Saskatchewan, until when it came my turn, there was no place left to go. My great-grandparents, who moved to Saskatchewan, were from Lachute and from an area around Mitchell in Ontario. And they moved there not coincidentally, just a couple of years after Dan Kennedy and his people and others on the plains of what was then the Northwest Territory were put onto reserves. Soon after that occurred, they were reduced to eating gophers and too little salt pork of too poor quality under the federal pretension that they were fulfilling terms of the treaty under the watch of John A. Macdonald. Farming, at least in my family, was always precarious. My mother, during the period of the 1930s, drought and depression, told us of a period of 3 to 4 years when there was no harvest, zero, no money coming into the family. They survived, unlike many of their neighbors who simply had to leave. They survived because they had a single well that didn't go dry. And my grandmother managed to grow a garden, and my grandfather managed to keep a few animals alive, and that's how they made it through those 4 years. Things were a little better when I was a kid. A couple of hours from where my mother grew up to where my father was, near the Carry the Kettle Reserve. We got electricity when I was a preschooler, thanks to the Prairie Farm Electrification Program. We had no plumbing. Running water was a 10-year-old kid with a 3-gallon bucket in each hand, carving a path from the well to the house. But I felt rich. Never richer than when I was on the back of my horse on the unbroken prairie of the nearby reserve, which was my favorite place to run. And the white-tailed deer flushing out of the coulees and the red-tailed hawks screaming overhead, and you could hear the field mice scurrying through the short grass of the unbroken, never broken prairie. So there's this island of ecological integrity in this otherwise area in which 90% of the land had been broken and was in wheat and barley and oats and summer fallow. When I was about 12, my father informed me there would be no way for me to make a livelihood with the livestock, which were my pride and passion. He was a good steward, as farmers go. He cared for the land in his way. But he said he had failed when he left the Air Force at the end of the Second World War to do what, in hindsight, he would have needed to do for us, for even one child, to inherit a livelihood. He had a typical conservative aversion to debt. and in not scaling up our acreages from the size that would have sufficed a decade earlier, our family's fate was sealed as farmers. And we were 5 children. And my mother, knowing what hard times were, had been preparing us and pushing us in our schooling so that we would have some options in life. I was the first in the history of my entire extended family to go to university. My father and my uncles mostly had grade 6 or grade 8 education. My mother and my aunts generally had a little more education because girls were spared some of the heaviest work on the farm and were often allowed to complete high school. My mother had went to teachers college, and so I was homeschooled on top of the rural schoolhouse to which my brothers and sisters and I went for our normal institutional schooling. So I have a kind of history as an economic refugee to thank for the fact that I'm an anthropologist or the fact that I'm standing here today. And I was angry that a process of capital concentration had ended a proud way of life for my parents and me and my siblings and many of our neighbors. I leaned to socialism in an effort to understand what was happening. And today, the economies of scale have left behind not one farm family in 3. And most of it is not healthy farming, relying as it does on elevated levels of herbicides, pesticides, chemical fertilizers. Who could fail to notice the irony that most of the settlers had become unsettled, and the lands we inhabited are increasingly contaminated by the very forces that ended the buffalo, displaced the Nakota and the Cree and the Saulteaux and the Kainai and the Siksika, and confined the survivors to postage stamp reserves. Today, in the places of my childhood, there are still quite a few deer, thanks to the farmers' crops that help to sustain good deer populations. But there are a lot fewer hawks, and the abundant prairie songbirds that used to dwell in the coulees and the back road allowances, which have now mostly been converted to agriculture. The butterflies that were so abundant in season are now increasingly rare. And so for me, when I go home and I see abandoned farmsteads, and when I remember how diverse and how abundant some of those places were, there's a double layer now of melancholy for me. I can't say that it's a joy it is a joy to go home, but it's also a sorrowful spectacle. There are 2 layers of melancholy now. There are the absent buffalo and the absent people who lived that way, and there's the absence of many people and the ecologies that I grew up with. So but there's a silver lining in my own experience that I came to know people that I otherwise would not have known. As a young man, I went to the upper Orinoco in Venezuela, and I lived with rainforest hunters for a period of time. I made my way back to the Canadian subarctic, and I've lived and worked with the Crees of Iuistsi for many decades now. And for a couple of decades, I've spent a lot of time in Torres Strait in northern Australia with the people of Hilda, who's with us this morning, and of Anik, who has made Torres Strait her home in through marriage. And from these people and with them, I've learned most of what I know that is relevant to the topics of this conference. And I just want to, I know I'm running, how much time do I'm probably in the hole at this point.
5 minutes. 5 minutes.
Okay, let me try to get some messages out then about, I wonder if maybe I could get them less light here. This is one of my teachers. This is a man named CICADA. He is from Erup in the eastern end of Torres Strait. Very near where the Great Barrier Reef tails off. When I first dove on the Great Barrier Reef in the late 1980s, it was an acid trip of polychromatic brilliance. I don't remember anything more beautiful. The last time I dove, much of that color was gone. Much of that coral had died. This guy and his buddies who are lifelong divers tell me that half of it is already dead. And they are on one of the most remote parts of the Great Barrier Reef. But I was talking with Sally. I was doing a kind of inventory and classification of the literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of marine species that he knows and has the names for. And I was talking to him about how do you categorize these things. So he was explaining to me how the shellfish and the fish and the birds and different things are in families, and we were going up to the kind of apex and so I wanted to know what's your word for living things, for all life? What gathers it all together? And he says, ididlu. And I said, and what's your word for things that are not life? And he scratched his head. And he said, well, to our way of thinking, there are things that live and then die, but they simply become other ways of living. So to our way of thinking, those tides and those winds and even those stars are other ways of living. Switching quickly to the other side of the planet, the subarctic of Iuistsi, as the living land, or the land of the people, as the Crees in what we now call northern Quebec call it. These are two of the elders who were gracious and generous with me and my family. We lived with them for several months in their winter hunting camp, Demarest and Sinclair Stewart. For these people, there is almost the same notion as ididlu. There's a word, iu, which is used to refer to the Cree people, but it's also used to refer to all indigenous people in some contexts. But it's also used to refer to all human beings in other contexts, and it is also used to refer to all of life. And again, as with ididlu, there is nothing which is not EU. So human identity was never separate from nature. There is no word for nature. Human identity is part of something that Another of my teachers, a man named Fred Georgekish, a philosopher, like Seli Taide, a natural philosopher. These guys are not older than me, but I guess I now look like an elder, but I think of them as elders even though they are, my contemporaries. Fred Georgekish explained to me, we have a word for life. It's very related to EU, but it carries a little different connotation. Madsiun. Madsiun, Fred said, is the continuous birthing of the world. And there's another word, which is sometimes used to express health, miupamatsiun, which means simply good, the good and right and proper continuous birthing of the world. So this notion we find it all over the planet in indigenous cultures. In Latin America, there are many different words for buen vivir, for living well. And that's the standard, surely, if we're to deal with the juggernaut of capitalist growth and the destruction that it inevitably is causing us. We have to move to a notion of miupmadsiun, of living well as the standard and the criterion, of finding richness in a more humble relationship with the material resources of our home. I was struck by the young drummer last night when he was talking about the community, the global community of humanity. Every breath of air we take has been through millions and billions of other sets of lungs, human and other than human. Every sip of water we take has circulated through countless other lives. How can we pretend that we are not connected and that we're not in this together? We have to acknowledge a profound equality. As when I go to hunt, the words of an old man, Geordie Georgekish, are in my dreams as I wake in the morning. His stories were so powerful that I internalized. He showed me how to be in that context of taking other lives, taking the bodies of other life and bringing them into my body and the body of my family, the bodies of my family. In a simple phrase, nidzmitz nitzatzak, which means you and I, it is the hunter speaking with the animal. It's the shaman communicating with the spirits of the animals. You and I have the same flesh or bodily covering. You and I have the same soul or spirit. So, unlike the Western, the European idea that it is okay to kill animals because we are superior, this is a profound statement of humility and of the receipt of a gift. Even though you and I have the same soul, spirit, flesh, this gift is conveyed, and with it comes enormous ethical responsibility to the other than human life. Humans, to support our kind, must consume other life, and we in turn will be consumed by that life. So I need to wrap up, and I just want to do that with words that I'm sure will be familiar to many of you. I'm sorry, but they resonate profoundly with me because not very long ago I spoke these words at my mother's funeral. a couple of years ago, because to me they capture the essence of life, and in some ways they capture the essence of the task that we have before us with respect not just to our personal lives, but with respect to life in general. This is Crowfoot. Crowfoot had the misfortune, really, of living at a time when he had to preside over the confinement of his people to reserves in Alberta. He was born Kainai and became Siksika, and a great war chief of the Siksika, but at a time, at a certain stage, he realized that resisting would be suicide, and he acceded then to the treaties. But what a poetic presence of mind. He, on his deathbed, these were his words: "What is life? It is the flash of a firefly in the night. It is the breath of a buffalo in the wintertime. It is the little shadow which runs across the grass and loses itself in the sunset." And it's right and proper that each one of us disappear or are dissolved eventually in that sunset. But it is not right and proper that all of life, it seems these days, with the great extinction episode that is now upon us, should be racing to that sunset. And our task here is to do what we can to ensure, as many of our Indigenous participants here over the past few days and for the coming few days have reminded us for the sake of our children and our grandchildren and our great-great-grandchildren and forward, that sunset, that beauty be there for a long time yet on this planet. Thank you for listening.